The knock came at twilight. Not the hurried rap of a neighbor seeking borrowed flour. Not the firm authority of the postman delivering another stack of condolence letters to the widows down the lane. This knock was different. 3 soft strikes against the weathered oak door, almost hesitant, as if the hand behind them might retreat at any moment. Carenza Whitford set down her quill, a single drop of ink blooming across the unfinished sentence she had been crafting. The candle beside her flickered, casting dancing shadows across the modest parlor of her family's cottage in Brindleshire. Outside, the last gasps of autumn surrendered to the creeping fingers of early winter, and the wind carried whispers of coming frost. She was not expecting anyone. Her father had passed 3 winters ago, leaving behind debts and a crumbling reputation. Her mother had followed him into the grave just 18 months later, her heart too shattered to continue beating in a world so determined to break it. At 22 years old, Carenza lived alone in the cottage that had once rung with laughter, surviving on the meager income she earned as a seamstress and the small stipend the Soldiers' Comfort Society provided for her volunteer work. 53 letters. That was how many she had written to a man she had never met. A soldier reported dying in a field hospital somewhere in the Northern Territories, his body riddled with shrapnel, his chances of survival measured in hours rather than days. The society had assigned him to her specifically because no one else wanted the burden of writing to a ghost. But Carenza had written anyway. She had poured her loneliness onto those pages, her fears, her small joys, her memories of a childhood spent chasing fireflies through meadows that no longer existed. She had described the way morning light fell through her kitchen window and how the baker's wife always saved her the bread rolls with the most golden crusts. She had confessed her dreams of seeing the sea someday, of feeling sand between her toes and tasting salt on her lips. She had written to a dying stranger as if he were the dearest friend she had ever known. And then, 6 weeks ago, the letters had stopped coming back. The society had informed her with clinical detachment that Corporal Hadrian Voss, identification number 7421, had succumbed to his injuries. The notification had been delayed, as so many were during wartime, lost in the chaos of overwhelmed field hospitals and bureaucratic confusion. They thanked her for her service. They assigned her a new soldier. They moved on. But Carenza had not moved on. She still dreamed of the words he had sent her in return, written in a hand that trembled but never faltered. He had called her letters a lifeline. He had said her descriptions of ordinary life reminded him why men fought and bled and died in muddy trenches so far from home. He had written that her words were the only warmth in a world that had grown unbearably cold. And now he was gone. Or so she had believed. The knock came again. Carenza rose from her chair, smoothing the front of her faded dress, suddenly aware of the ink stains on her fingers and the loose strands of chestnut hair escaping her braid. She crossed the small parlor in 6 steps, her hand trembling as it reached for the iron latch. The door swung open. A man stood on her doorstep. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a traveling coat that bore the dust of many miles. His face was shadowed by the brim of a hat pulled low, but she could see the sharp line of his jaw, the tension in his stance, the way his gloved hands hung at his sides, as if he did not know what to do with them. He looked at her, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. It was not recognition. It was something deeper, something that bordered on anguish. "Miss Whitford?" His voice was low, roughened by exhaustion or emotion. She could not tell which. "Miss Carenza Whitford?" Yes. The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "I am she." The man removed his hat. Dark hair, slightly disheveled from travel. Eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over winter fields. A face that might have been carved from marble if not for the scar that traced a jagged path from his left temple to his cheekbone. a face she had never seen, and yet, somehow, a face she knew. He took one step forward. "My name is not Hadrian Voss," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "Corporal Voss died in that field hospital 8 months ago, before your first letter ever arrived. I intercepted your correspondence because I was selfish, because I was dying in a different way, because your words were the only thing that made me want to survive." Carenza's hand flew to her chest, pressing against the sudden thunder of her heartbeat. "I do not understand," she breathed. The man's eyes glistened in the fading light. He dropped to one knee on her doorstep, his hat clutched against his chest, his head bowed in supplication. "Forgive me," he whispered. "My true name is Emmerich Thorn, and I am the Duke of Waldron." The world tilted beneath Carenza's feet. She gripped the doorframe to keep from falling, staring down at the kneeling figure before her, a man who had deceived her, a man who had stolen something precious under false pretenses, a man who now wore the face of a dying soldier and the title of one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom. And the worst part, the part that made her stomach clench and her eyes burn with unshed tears, was that even now, even knowing the depth of his deception, some treacherous corner of her heart recognized him. Not his face, not his name, not his title, but his words, his soul. The man she had fallen in love with through 53 letters. To understand how a duke came to kneel on the doorstep of a seamstress in Brindleshire, one must first understand the nature of the world that had shaped them both. The kingdom of Aldermain had been at war for 7 years. It was not a war of grand battles and heroic cavalry charges, though the ballads sung in taverns and parlors alike tried desperately to make it so. It was a war of attrition, of trenches dug into frozen earth, of young men shipped to the northern front and returned in pine boxes if they were lucky enough to be returned at all. The enemy empire of Kesteval had endless resources and bottomless cruelty, and the conflict had ground on until the very concept of peace felt like a fairy tale told to children. In the early years of the war, noble families had sent their sons with pride, outfitting them in gleaming uniforms and hosting elaborate farewell balls. By the 4th year, the gleaming uniforms had been replaced by practical wool, and the farewell balls had become quiet affairs marked by forced smiles and barely concealed dread. By the 7th year, the aristocracy had learned to hide their heirs, to fabricate medical conditions, and secure safe postings far from the front lines. But not all noble families had that luxury. The House of Thorn, rulers of the Duchy of Waldron for 17 generations, had always prided themselves on honor above all else. When the king himself had called for volunteers among the peerage, the old Duke of Waldron, Emmerich's father, had stood before the assembled lords and declared that his son would serve as any common soldier would serve. No special treatment, no purchased commission in a rearguard regiment. Emmerich Thorn would fight and bleed alongside the farmers' sons and the blacksmiths' apprentices. It had been a magnificent gesture. It had also been a death sentence. Emmerich had arrived at the Northern Front at 24 years old, full of the idealistic fervor that his tutors and his father had instilled in him. He had believed in duty. He had believed in sacrifice. He had believed that war, however terrible, held a kind of noble purpose that would forge him into the leader his duchy needed. That belief had lasted approximately 3 days. The reality of war was nothing like the poems. It was mud and blood and the screams of men whose bodies had been torn apart by weapons designed by brilliant minds for the sole purpose of destruction. It was watching friends die in your arms. It was killing other men who were just as frightened as you were, whose only crime was being born on the wrong side of a border drawn by kings who would never set foot on a battlefield. By the end of his first month, Emmerich had stopped believing in anything at all. He fought because fighting was what soldiers did. He survived because survival was an instinct that could not be reasoned away. But the man who had ridden north with dreams of glory was gone, replaced by a hollow shell that went through the motions of living without truly being alive. And then the shrapnel had found him. The explosion had come without warning during a night raid on an enemy supply line. One moment, Emmerich had been crouched in a ditch, signaling his men forward. The next, the world had become fire and noise and blinding pain. Metal fragments had torn through his side, his leg, his face. He had collapsed into the mud, certain that death had finally come to claim him, and had felt something very close to relief. But death, it seemed, had other plans. He had awakened in a field hospital, his body wrapped in bandages, his mind foggy from the laudanum they had poured down his throat. The surgeon had told him, with the blunt honesty that military doctors cultivated, that he would probably die. The wounds were too severe, infection too likely, supplies too scarce. They would do what they could, but he should make his peace. Emmerich had listened to these words and felt nothing at all. It was in that hospital, delirious with pain and resignation, that the first letter had arrived. Not addressed to him, of course. Addressed to Corporal Hadrian Voss, the man who had occupied the cot beside Emmerich's until a fever had claimed him in the night. The nurses had not yet updated their records, and so the letter, sent by some stranger through the Soldiers' Comfort Society, had been delivered to Voss's empty pillow. A young nurse had picked it up, glanced at the name, and made to throw it away. Wait. The word had scraped from Emmerich's throat before he knew he was speaking. Give it to me. She had frowned. It is not addressed to you, sir. Voss is dead. He has no one to read it, and I have no one to write to me. It was the truth. His father had forbidden any correspondence that might reveal Emmerich's location or condition, terrified that enemies of their house might use the information. His mother had died years ago. He had no siblings, no betrothed, and no close friends who had survived the war's endless hunger. He was utterly alone. The nurse had hesitated, then pressed the letter into his bandaged hand. It cannot hurt anything now, I suppose, she had murmured, and walked away. Emmerich had opened the letter with trembling fingers. The handwriting was neat and feminine, the paper simple but clean. The words were addressed to a stranger, offering comfort and companionship to a wounded soldier the writer had never met. But there was something in those words, some quality of genuine warmth and unguarded honesty, that pierced through the numbness Emmerich had wrapped around his heart. The letter was from a woman named Carenza Whitford, and it was the most beautiful thing Emmerich had ever read. He had known even then that what he was about to do was wrong. Hadrian Voss was dead. The letter was not meant for Emmerich. If he responded, he would be perpetuating a lie, stealing something that did not belong to him. But Emmerich Thorn, Duke of Valdren, heir to one of the oldest noble houses in Aldermain, was also a man who had lost everything except the will to draw breath. And so he had picked up a pen, and he had written back. Carenza Whitford had not always been alone. Once, when she was a girl of 7, her life had been full of warmth and color. Her father, Bertram Whitford, had been a merchant of modest but respectable success, trading in fabrics imported from the southern kingdoms. Her mother, Rosalind, had been the daughter of a schoolteacher, educated beyond her station, and possessed of a laugh that could fill any room with joy. They had lived in a proper house then, not the cramped cottage that Carenza now occupied. There had been a garden with roses and a cook named Millicent, who made the most extraordinary meat pies. There had been music lessons and dancing lessons, and dreams of a future that sparkled with possibility. Then the war had come. Not all at once. Wars rarely arrived with the dramatic fanfare that historians later ascribed to them. The conflict with Kesteval had begun as a border dispute, a minor skirmish over trading rights in the Northern Territories. But minor skirmishes had a way of growing, and within 2 years, the entire kingdom had been mobilized for a fight that no one had anticipated, and no one seemed able to stop. Bertram Whitford's trading routes had collapsed. The southern fabrics that had been his livelihood could no longer pass through war-torn regions, and the domestic markets were too flooded with desperate merchants to sustain his business. He had borrowed money to keep the household afloat, certain that the war would end soon, certain that prosperity would return. It had not. By the time Carenza was 14, her father's debts had consumed everything. The house with the rose garden was sold to pay creditors. Millicent was let go with tears and apologies. The family had retreated to a cottage on the edge of Brindleshire, a structure that had once belonged to a shepherd and still smelled faintly of wool and lanolin. Bertram had tried to rebuild. He had taken work as a clerk, his merchant skills adapted to keeping ledgers for men who had once been his competitors. But the shame of his fall had eaten at him, and the drink had followed. And by Carenza's 19th year, her father was a ghost of the man who had once lifted her onto his shoulders to pick apples from the highest branches. He had died in his sleep, his heart simply stopping as if it had decided that enough was enough. The doctor had called it a natural end. Carenza had known better. Her father's heart had not failed. It had surrendered. Her mother had followed 18 months later, worn down by grief and poverty, and the endless, grinding work of survival. Rosalind Whitford had once quoted poetry and debated philosophy. By the end, she could barely remember her own name. Carenza had buried them both in the small churchyard on the hill, in plots paid for by the charity of neighbors who remembered better days. She had stood alone at their graves, dry-eyed and hollow, and made herself a promise. She would not surrender. She would not let the war or the poverty or the loneliness grind her into dust. She would find a way to live, even if living meant nothing more than drawing breath and putting one foot in front of the other. And so she had. She had taken in sewing, her mother's taught skill becoming her salvation. She could mend a torn hem, or let out a bodice, or embroider initials onto handkerchiefs with a precision that earned grudging respect from the women of Brindleshire. The work was tedious and poorly paid, but it kept food on her table and coal in her hearth. It was not enough, though. Not for Carenza. The loneliness was the worst part. She had no family left, no close friends, no suitors calling at her door. The eligible young men of Brindleshire had marched north years ago, and those who had returned were broken in ways that made courtship impossible. Carenza spent her days bent over needlework, and her evenings staring at walls that seemed to close in a little more with each passing month. She had started writing letters to soldiers almost by accident. The Soldiers' Comfort Society had posted a notice in the village square, seeking volunteers to correspond with wounded men who had no families of their own. The society would provide names and addresses. The volunteers would provide words of comfort and connection. It was charity work, unpaid, but the society offered a small stipend for supplies and postage. Carenza had signed up the very next day. Her first assigned soldier had been a young man from the eastern provinces, barely 18, who had lost his leg to infection. She had written to him for 3 months before receiving word that he had recovered enough to return to his family. Her second had been an older sergeant who had lost his sight in a gas attack. He had written back in a shaky hand, thanking her for her kindness, until a brief note from a nurse had informed her that he had passed peacefully in his sleep. By the time Hadrian Voss's name had appeared on her assignment sheet, Carenza had grown accustomed to loss. Corporal Voss, the paperwork had said. Multiple shrapnel wounds, not expected to survive. No known family. Please write promptly. She had written that same evening, and the response had come 3 weeks later, in a hand that shook but formed letters with an elegance that surprised her. The handwriting of an educated man, she had thought. Perhaps a clerk or a teacher before the war had claimed him. The letters had continued. Week after week, month after month, Carenza had poured herself onto those pages, and the man who signed himself as Hadrian had poured himself back. They had shared stories and fears and dreams. They had debated the merits of different poets and argued about whether cats or dogs made better companions. They had confessed secrets that neither had ever spoken aloud to another living soul. Carenza had described the ache of watching her parents wither and die. Hadrian had described the horror of watching friends torn apart by artillery fire. She had admitted that she sometimes wondered if she would spend the rest of her life alone. He had admitted that he sometimes wondered if he deserved to survive when so many better men had not. They had found each other in the space between words. And Carenza, despite every rational voice warning her against such foolishness, had fallen in love. Not with a face or a body or a voice. She had never seen Hadrian Voss, never heard him speak, and never touched his hand. She had fallen in love with a soul laid bare on paper, with a mind that challenged hers, with a heart that seemed to beat in rhythm with her own. When the society had informed her of his death, something inside Carenza had shattered. She had not wept. She had not screamed. She had simply sat in her parlor, the letter clutched in her hands, and felt the last flicker of hope in her chest extinguish like a candle starved of air. For 6 weeks, she had gone through the motions of life. Sewing, eating, sleeping, writing letters to her new assigned soldier, a man whose responses were polite but distant, whose words on the page stirred nothing in her heart. She had resigned herself to the emptiness. And then had come the knock at twilight. And now, standing in her doorway with the wind biting at her cheeks and her pulse thundering in her ears, Carenza stared down at the kneeling figure of a man who claimed to be a duke. A man who had lied to her. A man who had stolen her words and her confidences under false pretenses. A man whose eyes, even now, held the same desperate loneliness she had glimpsed between the lines of 53 letters. "Get up," she whispered. "Get up off my doorstep before the neighbors see." Emmerich Thorne rose slowly, his movements stiff. Whether from travel or injury, she could not tell. He towered over her, this stranger who was not a stranger, and his expression held a vulnerability that seemed utterly at odds with the title he had claimed. "Miss Whitford, please, if you would allow me to explain—" "Explain?" The word came out sharp enough to cut. "Explain how you intercepted letters meant for a dead man. Explain how you pretended to be someone you were not. Explain how you let me believe I was writing to a dying soldier when you were actually— What? Amusing yourself? Playing some cruel game? No." His voice cracked. "Never that. I swear to you, on everything I hold sacred, it was never a game." "Then what was it?" He opened his mouth to answer. And that was when Carenza noticed the blood seeping through the side of his coat. "You are bleeding." The words fell from Carenza's lips before she could stop them, her anger momentarily displaced by the practical instincts that had kept her alive through years of solitary survival. She had seen blood before, had cleaned wounds, and stitched torn flesh when neighbors could not afford a doctor. The dark stain spreading across Emmerich's coat was unmistakable. He glanced down as if noticing it for the first time. "It is nothing," he said, though his voice had grown thinner. "An old wound that reopened during the journey. I have ridden 3 days without proper rest." "3 days?" Carenza's brow furrowed despite herself. "From where?" "From Valdren. From my estate." He swayed slightly, catching himself against the doorframe. "I could not wait any longer. I had to see you. I had to tell you the truth before—" He did not finish the sentence. Carenza stood frozen in the doorway. caught between the fury that still burned in her chest and the undeniable reality that the man before her was injured and exhausted, and quite possibly on the verge of collapse. Every rational thought screamed at her to slam the door in his face, to let him find his own way to a surgeon, to wash her hands of this deception and the deceiver who had perpetrated it. But Carenza Whitford had never been very good at listening to rational thoughts. "Come inside," she heard herself say, "before you bleed to death on my doorstep, and I am forced to explain your corpse to the constable." She stepped back, holding the door open, and after a moment's hesitation, Emmerich Thorne crossed the threshold into her home. The cottage felt smaller with him in it. He seemed to fill the modest parlor simply by existing, his presence too large for a space designed for solitary living. Carenza gestured toward the worn armchair by the hearth, and he lowered himself into it with a grimace that he could not quite conceal. "Remove your coat," she ordered, already moving toward the small cabinet where she kept her medical supplies. "And your waistcoat. I need to see the wound. Miss Whitford, truly, it is not necessary. You have lied to me for nearly a year." She did not turn to look at him as she gathered clean cloths and the jar of salve she made from herbs gathered in the meadow. "The least you can do is allow me to ensure you do not die before I have finished being angry with you." A sound escaped him that might have been a laugh if it had not been so laden with pain. "That is fair," he admitted. When she turned back, he had shed his coat and was struggling with the buttons of his waistcoat, his fingers clumsy with exhaustion. Carenza set down her supplies, and without asking permission, moved his hands aside and unfastened the buttons herself. The intimacy of the action struck her only after it was done, her fingers brushing against the fine fabric of his shirt, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. She stepped back quickly, her cheeks flushing. "The shirt as well," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "At least enough to expose the wound." Emmerich complied, pulling the shirt free from his trousers and lifting it to reveal his side. Carenza drew in a sharp breath. The wound itself was not as severe as she had feared, a gash perhaps 4 inches long that had clearly been stitched at some point and had torn partially open. But it was not the fresh injury that stole her composure. It was the landscape of scars that surrounded it. His torso was a map of violence. Raised white lines crisscrossed his ribs, where shrapnel had torn through flesh. A puckered circle near his hip marked where something, a bullet perhaps, had entered and been removed. Burns climbed his left side, the skin permanently discolored and textured like melted wax. These were not the marks of a single injury. These were the accumulated wounds of a man who had spent years in the hell of the Northern Front. The man she had imagined as Hadrian Voss, dying quietly in a hospital bed, had been a convenient fiction. The reality was far worse. "The explosion," Emmerich said quietly, watching her face. "And what came before? And what came after? War is not kind to those who survive it." Carenza forced herself to move, to dip a cloth in the basin of water she had prepared, to begin cleaning the reopened wound with hands that trembled only slightly. "You should have died," she said, the words coming out harsher than she intended. "I know." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I should have died a dozen times over. I wanted to, for a while. After the explosion, when they told me I would probably not survive the week, I felt relieved. I thought the war had finally found a way to end, at least for me." Her hand stilled on his skin. "What changed?" "Your letters." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. "The first one arrived the morning after Hadrian Voss died," Emmerich continued. "I was delirious with fever, certain each breath would be my last. And then this nurse handed me an envelope addressed to a dead man, and I opened it because I had nothing left to lose. And I read your words and—" He paused, struggling to find language adequate to the memory. "You wrote about the light in your kitchen," he said finally. about how it fell through the window at a certain angle in the morning and turned everything golden. Such a small thing. Such an ordinary thing. But I had not thought about light or gold or ordinary mornings in so long that I had forgotten they existed. Your letter reminded me that somewhere, far from the mud and the blood and the screaming, there was a woman watching sunlight through a window and finding beauty in it. Carenza pressed the cloth harder against his wound, using the task to anchor herself. So, you stole a dead man's correspondence because you liked my description of sunshine? I stole a dead man's correspondence because I was drowning, Emmerich said, and there was no self-pity in his voice, only the flat honesty of a man stating an undeniable truth. And your words were the only rope anyone had thrown me in years. She finished cleaning the wound in silence, applied the salve with careful fingers, pressed a fresh bandage against his side, and wrapped it in place with strips of clean linen. When she was done, she stepped back and turned away, unable to look at him any longer. You should have told me, she said to the wall. You should have told me who you were. I know. I mourned you. Her voice cracked. When the society told me Hadrian Voss was dead, I mourned you. I wept for a man I had never met, a man who never existed, while you were… What? Recovered? Returned to your grand estate? Living your life as a duke while I grieved over an empty grave? No. The word came sharp and sudden. No, I was not recovered. I was barely alive. After I read your first letter and wrote back, my condition worsened drastically. The surgeon saved my body, but the man I had been was gone. I spent months learning to walk again, learning to hold a pen without my hand shaking, learning to sleep without waking, screaming from nightmares that never truly ended. And through all of it, the only thing that kept me tethered to this world was the knowledge that somewhere in Brindleshire there was a woman who had written 53 letters to a soldier she believed was dying, and every single one of those letters had been a gift I did not deserve. Carenza's shoulders shook, though whether from anger or grief or something else entirely, she could not have said. Why did you come here? She asked. Why now, after all this time? Because I could not live with the lie any longer. Emmerich's voice dropped to a ragged whisper. And because I needed to see your face, just once, even if you hate me, even if you send me away and never speak to me again, I needed to know that you were real. She turned then, slowly, and found him watching her with eyes that held no defense, no pretense, and no aristocratic distance. Just a man, broken and bleeding and terrified, offering her the truth at last. And Carenza realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that her anger was not the only emotion warring for dominance in her heart. She should have sent him away. Every principle Carenza possessed, every instinct honed by years of disappointment and loss, demanded that she order this man out of her cottage and out of her life. He had lied to her. He had manipulated her emotions under false pretenses. He had allowed her to bare her soul to a fiction while concealing his true identity behind a dead man's name. And yet, when she looked at Emmerich Thorne, she didn't see the Duke of Waldron. She didn't see wealth or power or the aristocratic privilege that had always seemed so distant from her small, struggling existence. She saw the words that had been written on page after page of correspondence that she kept bundled in ribbon in the drawer beside her bed. She saw the man who had confessed his terror of dying alone, who had described the nightmare of watching his closest friend bleed out in his arms, unable to do anything but hold him and whisper lies about how everything would be all right, who had admitted that some nights the only thing preventing him from walking into enemy fire was the knowledge that her next letter might be waiting for him. That man wasn't a fiction. That man was sitting in her parlor, his side bound in bandages she had applied, his eyes watching her with a vulnerability that no duke should ever allow a seamstress to witness. "You cannot stay here," Carenza said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "The neighbors will talk. My reputation is already precarious enough without harboring strange men overnight." "I have rooms at the inn in town," Emmerich replied. "I did not presume. I would never—" He stopped, took a breath, began again. "I only came to confess, to beg your forgiveness. I had no expectation that you would want anything to do with me once you knew the truth." "Then why come at all?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Because I owed you the truth," he said slowly. "Because every moment I did not tell you felt like a blade twisting in my chest. Because—" he hesitated, then continued with the air of a man stepping off a cliff. "Because I have spent the last 8 months wondering what your voice sounds like. Wondering if your eyes are as warm as your words. Wondering if the woman who wrote those letters could ever look at a broken soldier and see something worth loving." Carenza felt her lungs tighten. "I am not a soldier," she reminded him. "You are a duke. Whatever you imagined between us, whatever connection you thought we shared through letters, it cannot exist in the real world. People like you do not marry people like me. They do not even acknowledge people like me in public. I am a seamstress, a nobody, the daughter of a failed merchant who died in debt." "I know who you are." Emmerich's voice was steady despite the pain that still tightened his features. "I know everything you told me in your letters, and I know everything you did not tell me that I read between the lines. I know that your father's failure was not your fault, and I know that your mother's death left a wound that has never fully healed. I know that you are lonely and proud and stubborn, and far too intelligent for the life circumstances have forced upon you." He leaned forward in the chair, wincing at the pull on his injured side. "I also know that you are the only person in the world who has ever seen me clearly. Not the Duke of Waldron. Not the heir to an ancient house. Me. The man who is terrified of the dark because it reminds him of the trenches. The man who cannot hear thunder without flinching. The man who has spent his entire life being told what he should be, while never being asked what he wanted to be. And what do you want to be?" The question escaped before Carenza could stop it. Emmerich held her gaze. "Yours," he said simply. "If you will have me." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything Carenza thought she knew about the world and her place in it. She turned away sharply, pacing to the window, staring out at the darkened lane beyond her cottage. "You do not know me," she said to the glass. "You know the version of me that existed on paper, the version that had time to consider her words, to craft her sentences, to present herself in the best possible light. The real Carenza is not nearly so eloquent. She is impatient and quick-tempered and prone to saying things she regrets. I know." She could hear the smile in his voice. "You told me as much in your 31st letter. The one where you described losing your temper with the baker's wife and spending the rest of the day mortified by your own behavior." Carenza closed her eyes. Of course he remembered. Of course he had memorized her letters just as she had memorized his. "This is madness," she whispered. "Yes," Emmerich agreed. "It is absolute madness. A duke pursuing a seamstress because she wrote him letters that saved his life. It is the sort of thing that only happens in fairy tales, and I stopped believing in fairy tales somewhere around my 3rd month in the trenches." "Then why?" "Because you are real." His voice dropped to something barely above a breath. "Because I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who wanted my title, or my money, or my influence, and not a single one of them ever asked how I was feeling, or whether I slept well, or what I dreamed about when the nightmares finally let me rest. You asked. You cared. You treated me like a human being instead of an asset to be acquired. And you did it without knowing that I had anything to offer in return." Carenza pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window. "What if I cannot forgive you?" she asked quietly. "What if the lie is too much? What if every time I look at you, I see the deception instead of the man?" There was a long pause before Emmerich answered. "Then I will accept your judgment and go," he said. "I will return to Valdren and spend the rest of my life knowing that I found the only person who ever truly knew me, and lost her because of my own cowardice. But I will not regret coming here tonight. Even if you hate me, even if you never want to see my face again, I will be grateful that I had the chance to tell you the truth. You deserved at least that much." Carenza turned from the window. He sat in her shabby armchair, this duke of ancient lineage, his fine clothes rumpled and stained with travel and blood, his face pale from exhaustion and pain, and watched her with eyes that asked for nothing and expected less. She thought of her father, who had promised her mother the world and delivered only heartbreak. She thought of the soldiers who had marched north with dreams of glory and returned as broken shells or did not return at all. She thought of every cautionary tale she had ever heard about women who trusted too easily and loved too deeply and paid the price for their foolishness. And then she thought of 53 letters tied with ribbon, sitting in the drawer beside her bed, each one a thread connecting her to a man she had never expected to meet. "There is a spare room," she heard herself say. "It is small and cold, and the bed has not been aired in months. But it is better than riding back to the inn in the dark with a wound that has already reopened once." Emmerich's eyes widened. "Miss Whitford, I could not possibly." "You will sleep in the spare room," Carenza continued, her voice firm. "And in the morning, when we are both rested and thinking more clearly, we will have a proper conversation about what happens next. I am not saying I forgive you. I am not saying I trust you. I am saying that I refuse to make a decision this important while standing in my parlor at midnight with a bleeding duke who looks like he might collapse at any moment." A ghost of a smile crossed Emmerich's face. "That is the most reasonable thing anyone has said to me in years," he murmured. "Yes, well." Carenza lifted her chin. "Someone has to be reasonable. It is clearly not going to be you." She moved toward the narrow hallway that led to the spare room, gesturing for him to follow. And as he rose from the chair and limped after her, Carenza tried very hard not to think about the fact that she had just invited the Duke of Voldren to spend the night under her roof. The gossips of Brindleshire would have a field day. But that, she decided, was a problem for tomorrow. Sleep did not come easily to Carenza that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware of the presence in her spare room just 12 feet away. Every creak of the cottage, every whisper of wind against the windows, seemed magnified to impossible volume. She could hear him moving occasionally, restless in an unfamiliar bed, and each sound sent a fresh jolt of confusion through her already tangled thoughts. The Duke of Valdren was sleeping in her spare room, the words repeated in her mind like a fever dream, refusing to coalesce into anything resembling sense. Men like Emmerich Thorne did not appear on the doorsteps of women like her. They did not kneel in supplication or confess their sins with tears in their eyes. They certainly did not accept invitations to sleep in cramped rooms with mattresses that had not been aired in months. And yet, impossibly, here they were. Carenza pressed her hands against her face, trying to force order onto her churning emotions. She should be furious. She was furious. The deception he had perpetrated was a violation of everything she held sacred. The trust she had placed in a stranger. The vulnerability she had offered to a man she believed was dying. He had stolen something precious from her, something she could never fully reclaim. But beneath the fury, There was something else. Something that had been growing in the soil of her heart for months, nurtured by words on paper and the intimacy of shared confession. She had fallen in love with Hadrian Voss, the dying soldier who existed only in letters. And now she was forced to confront the possibility that the man she loved and the man who had deceived her were one and the same. Could love survive such a revelation? Could trust ever be rebuilt on a foundation of lies? She did not know, and the uncertainty was almost worse than the anger. Morning arrived slowly, gray light filtering through the thin curtains of her bedroom window. Carenza rose before dawn, as was her habit, and dressed in her simplest work dress before making her way to the kitchen. She needed routine. She needed normalcy. She needed the familiar comfort of tasks that required no emotional labor. She was halfway through preparing tea when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Emmerich appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking slightly better than he had the night before. Sleep had softened the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, though the pallor of pain still clung to his features. He had smoothed his rumpled clothes as best he could, and someone, perhaps himself during the night, had combed his dark hair into a semblance of order. He looked, Carenza thought despite herself, like a man trying very hard to be presentable for someone whose opinion mattered to him. "Good morning," he said carefully, hovering at the threshold, as if unsure whether he was welcome to enter. "Sit." Carenza nodded toward the small table by the window. "I am making tea. There is bread, though I cannot promise it is fresh." "Thank you." He moved into the room slowly, easing himself into one of the two chairs, with a barely suppressed wince. "Miss Whitford, I want you to know that I am prepared to answer any questions you have. I will tell you everything. Hold nothing back. You deserve complete honesty, and I intend to provide it." Carenza busied herself with the tea things, grateful for an excuse to keep her hands occupied. "Very well," she said. "Tell me about the real Hadrian Voss." The question seemed to catch him off guard. "The real? I am not certain what you mean. The man whose letters I was supposed to be receiving." Carenza turned to face him, a cup of steaming tea in each hand. "You said he died before my first letter arrived. Tell me about him. Tell me about the man whose identity you borrowed." Emmerich accepted the tea with a murmur of thanks, then stared into the cup as if searching for answers in its depths. "Hadrian Voss was a corporal from a village called Dunmore, near the eastern border," he said quietly. "He was a farmer's son, barely 20 years old when he enlisted, barely 22 when the shrapnel found him. We shared a ward in the field hospital for 4 days before the fever took him." "Did you know him? Before the hospital, I mean." "No, we had never met. But in those 4 days," Emmerich paused, his jaw tightening. "He talked about his family, his mother and father, and 3 younger sisters. He talked about the apple orchard behind their farmhouse and the way the blossoms looked in spring. He was terrified of dying, but even more terrified of what his death would do to his family. They depended on him. He was the eldest son, the one who was supposed to take over the farm when his father grew too old to work." Carenza sat down across from him, her own tea untouched. "What happened to his family after he died?" "I do not know." The admission seemed to pain him. "I was unconscious for nearly 2 weeks after writing back to your first letter. My condition worsened drastically. By the time I recovered enough to inquire, his body had been buried in a mass grave with dozens of others. There was no way to notify his family, no personal effects to return. He simply vanished, as if he had never existed. Except for his name," Carenza said softly. "Which you took." "Yes." Emmerich met her eyes. "I took his name because I didn't want to be Emmerich Thorn anymore. The Duke who had marched north full of noble ideals and watched those ideals die alongside good men who deserved better. Hadrian Voss was innocent. He was just a farmer's son who wanted to go home. When I wrote to you using his name, I could pretend that I was innocent too, that the burden of my title and my failures and my guilt did not exist. The honesty in his voice cut through Carenza's defenses more effectively than any justification could have. "That is not an excuse," she said quietly. "You understand that. Nothing you say will excuse what you did. I know. But I think I understand why you did it." She wrapped her hands around her teacup, absorbing its warmth. "I understand what it means to want to be someone else. To wish you could shed your history like a snake sheds its skin and emerge as something new." Emmerich said nothing, merely watched her with those gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "There is something else I need to know," Carenza continued. "Something I have been wondering since last night. Ask me anything. You said you intercepted my letters because you were dying and alone and desperate for connection. I can accept that, even if I cannot forgive it yet. But here is what I do not understand." She leaned forward, holding his gaze. "You recovered. You survived. You returned to Valdrin and reclaimed your title and your life. You had every opportunity to end the deception then, to write to me as yourself and explain what had happened. Instead, you continued the charade for months. Why?" Emmerich set down his teacup with deliberate care. "Because I was afraid," he said. "Afraid of what? My anger? I think we have established that my anger was inevitable regardless of timing." "No." He shook his head slowly. "Not afraid of your anger. Afraid of your pity." The answer caught Carenza off guard. "I do not understand. When I wrote to you as Hadrian Voss, dying soldier, I was just a man, a broken, wounded man who had nothing to offer except words on a page. And you responded to those words with kindness and warmth and understanding. You saw me as a person, not as a title or a fortune or a political opportunity." His voice dropped. "I was terrified that the moment you learned I was the Duke of Valdrin, everything would change. That you would see me differently. That the connection we had built would be poisoned by what my name represents." Carenza felt something shift in her chest, a crack in the wall she had been trying to maintain between herself and this impossible situation. "You thought I would treat you differently because you are wealthy and powerful?" "Everyone treats me differently because I am wealthy and powerful." The bitterness in his tone was unmistakable. "People who despised me yesterday become my dearest friends when they learn my title. People who ignored me suddenly hang on my every word. The world bends itself around a duke in ways that make it impossible to know what is genuine and what is performance." He looked at her, and for a moment, the mask of aristocratic composure slipped entirely. "You are the only person who has ever known me without knowing what I am worth," he said, and I was not ready to give that up. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft crackle of the fire and the distant call of morning birds outside the window. Carenza stared at the man across from her, this duke who had deceived her, and this stranger who knew her better than anyone alive, and felt the ground beneath her certainties begin to tremble. She had planned to send him away this morning. She had planned to deliver a firm but dignified rejection, to wish him well and close the door on this chapter of her life forever. But plans, she was beginning to realize, had very little power against the chaos of the human heart. "I cannot promise you forgiveness," she said at last, "and I certainly cannot promise you trust. But I am willing to continue this conversation, provided you answer one more question honestly." "Anything." "What do you actually want from me, Emmerich Thorn?" She used his real name deliberately, watching the way it landed on his features. "Not the pretty words about seeing your face or knowing I was real. I want the truth. What do you want from a seamstress in Brindleshire that you cannot find among the noblewomen who must be lining up to marry a duke?" He held her gaze without flinching. "I want to know if what I feel when I read your letters is real," he said. "I want to know if the woman I fell in love with through words on paper exists in flesh and blood. And if she does, if she can look at me knowing everything I have done and everything I am, I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of her." Carenza felt her heart stutter against her ribs. It was madness. It was impossible. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, and everything she had ever been warned against, and she had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The days that followed existed in a strange suspension between reality and dream. Emmerich did not leave Brindleshire. He had intended to, or so he claimed, once their morning conversation had concluded. He would return to the inn, he said. He would give her space to think. He would wait for her decision, with whatever patience he could muster. But then his wound had reopened again while rising from the table, blood seeping through the fresh bandages, and Carenza had insisted he remain until it healed properly. It was practical, she told herself. Sensible. She was simply ensuring that a man did not bleed to death because of her stubbornness. It had nothing to do with the way her heart lifted each time she saw him sitting by her hearth. 3 days passed, then 4. Emmerich's wound began to knit itself together under Carenza's careful ministrations, and still he did not leave. They fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and achingly familiar, as if they had been sharing this small cottage for years instead of days. He helped her with tasks she had not asked him to help with, chopping wood for the fire, even though the effort clearly pained him, carrying water from the well at the edge of her property, small domestic labors that a duke had no business performing, and yet he performed them without complaint, as if manual work was a novelty he had been denied too long. And they talked. Not about the deception, not at first. They talked about the same things they had written about in their letters, but now, with the added dimension of voice and expression, and the subtle language of the body. Emmerich described the estate at Voldren, the rolling hills and ancient forests, and the crumbling tower where he had played as a child. Carenza told him about her parents, about the rose garden she still dreamed of sometimes, about the meat pies that Millicent used to make, and how she had never been able to replicate the recipe. It was during one of these conversations, on the evening of the 4th day, that Carenza finally asked the question that had been haunting her. "The scars on your body," she said quietly. They were sitting by the fire, the remnants of a simple supper cleared away, the comfortable silence of shared domesticity wrapped around them like a blanket. "You said they came from the explosion, but some of them looked older." Emmerich's hand drifted unconsciously to his side, pressing against the hidden landscape of damage beneath his shirt. "Some of them are," he admitted. "The war was not a single event for me. It was years of accumulated violence. The explosion that nearly killed me was simply the final chapter of a very long story. Tell me." He looked at her, assessing, and Carenza saw the moment he decided to trust her with something he had never shared. "I arrived at the front full of idealistic nonsense," he began, convinced that honor and courage and noble purpose would see me through. Within a week, I had watched 3 men from my regiment die in ways that no one should ever have to witness. Within a month, I had killed my first enemy soldier. A boy, really. Barely old enough to shave. He came at me in the dark, and I reacted on instinct. And by the time I realized what I had done, he was bleeding out in my arms. Carenza said nothing, but she reached across the space between them and placed her hand over his. "The first scar came from a bayonet," Emmerich continued, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "A night raid that went wrong. An enemy soldier who was faster than I expected. If my sergeant had not been there to pull me clear, I would have died in my first month. But you survived. I survived. Again and again, I survived when others did not. And each time I walked away from something that should have killed me, the guilt grew heavier. He turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together. Do you know what they called me by the end? The soldiers in my regiment? Carenza shook her head. The Ghost Duke, because I walked through battles that claimed everyone around me and emerged without a scratch. They thought I was blessed, protected by some divine providence. A bitter laugh escaped him. They did not see me in the dark hours, shaking and weeping and begging whatever gods might exist to explain why I deserved to live when so many better men had died. The firelight flickered across his features, illuminating the scar that traced from his temple to his cheek, and Carenza saw him clearly for the first time. Not a duke, not a deceiver, just a man who had been broken by circumstances beyond his control and was still, somehow, trying to find his way back to wholeness. The letters, she said softly. My letters. You said they saved you. They did. His grip on her hand tightened. Before you, I had accepted that survival was merely a biological function. My heart beat, my lungs drew breath, but there was something inside me that could be called living. Your words changed that. You reminded me that there was beauty in the world, that ordinary mornings and golden light and the smell of fresh bread were worth fighting for. I did not know I was doing anything so grand. Carenza's voice trembled slightly. I was just writing to a stranger because I was lonely. That is precisely why it mattered. Emmerich lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles, so gentle it made her chest ache. You were not performing kindness for an audience. You were simply being yourself, offering connection to someone you believed had no one else. That authenticity is the rarest thing I have ever encountered. Carenza felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. I'm still angry with you, she whispered. You need to know that. The lie still hurts. I know. But I think... She paused, searching for words adequate to the chaos of her emotions. I think I am beginning to understand why you told it. And I think I am beginning to understand that the man who lied to me and the man who wrote those letters are the same person. That the deception does not erase the truth underneath it. Emmerich's eyes glistened in the firelight. Does that mean you might be able to forgive me? Someday. Carenza looked at him, this broken duke who had stumbled into her life and upended everything she thought she knew about herself and the world. I do not know, she said honestly, but I think I would like the chance to find out. The smile that crossed his face was like sunrise after a long and terrible night. And for the first time since his knock had echoed through her cottage, Carenza felt something that might have been hope. News of the Duke of Waldron's presence in Brindleshire spread faster than fire through dry grass. Carenza had known it would happen eventually. A village this small could not absorb a stranger, let alone an aristocrat, without comment. But she had hoped for a few more days of privacy, a few more stolen hours in which to untangle her feelings before the outside world intruded. She had hoped in vain. The first visitors arrived on the 5th morning, a delegation of the village's most prominent citizens, led by Magistrate Corwin, a portly man with a red face and an inflated sense of his own importance. They knocked on Carenza's door with the aggressive courtesy of people who believed they had every right to be there. Miss Whitford. The magistrate's eyes swept past her into the cottage, searching. We have heard disturbing reports that you are harboring a man of unknown origin in your home. As representatives of the community's moral welfare, we feel obligated to investigate. Carenza felt her spine stiffen. I am harboring an injured traveler who required medical attention, she said coolly. I was unaware that Christian charity had become a matter for official investigation. Christian charity does not typically involve unmarried women sheltering strange men under their roofs. The magistrate's tone dripped with insinuation. The reputation of this village is no concern of yours regarding my household? The voice came from behind Carenza, deep and carrying an authority that made the magistrate's face go pale. Emmerich stepped into the doorway, his bearing transformed. Gone was the vulnerable man who had knelt on her doorstep begging forgiveness. In his place stood the Duke of Valdrin, every inch of him radiating the power of 17 generations of noble blood. Your Grace. The magistrate's voice emerged as a strangled squeak. He dropped into a bow so deep his waistcoat buttons strained. We had no idea. That is to say, we were not informed. The honor of your presence in our humble village is my own affair. Emmerich's tone could have frozen water. As is my choice of accommodations and the company I keep. Miss Whitford has shown me extraordinary kindness during a difficult journey. I trust you are not suggesting that her hospitality was in any way improper. No, Your Grace, certainly not. You merely came to gossip and pry into matters that do not concern you. Emmerich took a step forward, and the magistrate retreated as if pushed. I suggest you return to your homes and inform anyone who asks that Miss Whitford has acted with perfect propriety, and that any whispers to the contrary will be met with my personal displeasure. The delegation scattered like leaves before a gale. Carenza watched them go, her emotions a tangled knot of gratitude and unease. When she turned back to Emmerich, he had deflated slightly, the ducal authority giving way to something closer to embarrassment. I apologize, he said quietly. I did not mean to handle your affairs for you, but I could not stand by and let them impugn your reputation when I am the cause of their suspicions. You did not need to defend me. Carenza's voice came out sharper than she intended. I have been managing the opinions of this village for years without aristocratic intervention. I know. I overstepped. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had come to recognize. It is a failing of mine. When I see someone I care about being attacked, I react before I think. Someone I care about. The words hung between them, and Carenza felt the balance of power shift in a way she had not anticipated. In their letters, they had been equals, two lonely souls reaching across the void. But in the real world, he was a duke, and she was a seamstress, and that gap could be bridged only if he chose to bridge it. She had assumed, without quite realizing it, that his title gave him all the power in their relationship. But watching him now, she understood something crucial. He needed her approval more than she needed his protection. Sit down, she said, gesturing toward the kitchen table. We need to talk about what happens next. Emmerich obeyed, settling into a chair with the wariness of a man who sensed he was about to face judgment. Carenza sat across from him, folding her hands on the table. You cannot stay here indefinitely, she said. Even with your intervention today, the gossip will continue. Within a week, every tongue in Brindleshire will be wagging about the seamstress and the duke. My livelihood depends on the goodwill of this community. I cannot afford to become a scandal. I understand. His voice was carefully controlled. I will leave today, if that is what you wish. That is not what I said. Carenza held his gaze. I said you cannot stay here indefinitely. I did not say I wanted you to leave. Hope flickered in his eyes, quickly suppressed. Then what do you want? It was the same question she had asked him, turned back on her like a mirror reflecting truths she had not yet acknowledged. I want time, she said slowly. Time to know you as you actually are, not as the fiction you created. Time to determine whether what I feel is real or simply the echo of something that never existed. She paused, gathering her courage. I want you to return to Voldrin, to resume your life and your duties, and I want you to write to me, not as Hadrian Voss, as yourself. Emmerich leaned forward. You want to begin again? I want to see if we can build something true on the foundation of something false. Carenza's voice trembled slightly despite her efforts to control it. Your letters made me fall in love with a stranger. Perhaps your letters can make me fall in love with the real man instead. The silence stretched between them, taut with possibility. And if I agree? Emmerich asked quietly. If I return to Valdrin and write to you as myself, what then? How long do we continue this correspondence before we decide whether it leads anywhere? I do not know. Carenza shook her head. I cannot give you guarantees or timelines. I can only tell you that I am not ready to close the door on you completely, but I am also not ready to fling it open and invite you into my life without reservation. That is more than I deserve. Yes, she agreed. It is. But I have discovered that my heart does not always care what people deserve. Emmerich rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat. He knelt beside her, taking her hands in his, and looked up at her with an expression of such naked vulnerability that it stole her breath. I will write to you, he said, every day if you will permit it. I will tell you everything about my life, my duties, my fears, my hopes. I will hold nothing back. And when you are ready, if you are ever ready, I will return to Brindleshire and ask you the question I am desperate to ask you now. What question? His thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. Whether you will allow me to court you properly, he said. As Emmerich Thorne, Duke of Voldrin, pursuing Carenza Whitford, the woman who saved his life with nothing but words and kindness. Carenza felt warmth spill from her eyes and trace down her cheeks. Ask me again when you have earned the right, she whispered. I will spend every moment until then trying to earn it. He raised her hands to his lips and kissed them, first one and then the other, with a tenderness that made her heart crack open. And when he departed that afternoon, riding toward the main road that would carry him back to Valdrin, Carenza stood in her doorway and watched until he disappeared from sight. She did not know if she would ever see him again. But she knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that she desperately wanted to. The letters began arriving within a week. True to his word, Emmerich wrote nearly every day, his correspondence delivered by private courier rather than the ordinary post. The villagers of Brindleshire had plenty to whisper about as they watched the livered messenger ride up to Carenza's cottage with clockwork regularity, but she found she cared less about their opinions than she had expected. Let them talk. She had more important things to focus on. The first letter had been brief, almost tentative, as if Emmerich was uncertain how to begin this new chapter of their correspondence. Miss Whitford, it read, I arrived at Valdrin late last evening, exhausted but safely. The journey was long, and I confess that my thoughts returned constantly to the cottage I had left behind. I find myself wondering what you are doing at every moment of the day. Are you working on your sewing? Are you reading by the fire? Are you thinking of me at all? Or have you already begun the sensible process of forgetting that I ever existed? I do not expect answers to these questions. I simply wanted you to know that you occupy my mind as completely as you occupied my letters. Yours in hope and uncertainty. Emmerich Carenza had read the letter 3 times before allowing herself to respond, and so began a correspondence that was both achingly familiar and entirely new. This time, there were no false identities, no dying soldier's borrowed name. Emmerich wrote to her as himself, describing his daily life at Valdrin, with a candor that surprised her. He told her about the endless meetings with stewards and accountants, the tedious social obligations that came with his title, the loneliness of rattling around in a vast estate with no one to share it with. He told her about the nightmares that still plagued him, the way certain sounds or smells could transport him instantly back to the trenches. He told her about the guilt he carried for the men who had died under his command, the faces that visited him in the dark hours when sleep refused to come. And he told her about his growing feelings for her, expressed with a directness that made her pulse quicken. "I think about you constantly," he wrote in his 15th letter. "Not the idealized version of you that I constructed during our first correspondence, but the real woman I met in Brindleshire, the one who bandaged my wounds with steady hands and sharp words, the one who refused to let me collapse on her doorstep despite having every reason to slam the door in my face, the one whose anger is as genuine as her compassion, whose strength is matched only by her vulnerability. That woman haunts me in ways I cannot fully express." Carenza wrote back with equal honesty, sharing the details of her own small life. The clients who commissioned her sewing, the neighbors who had begun treating her with a new and unsettling deference since word spread of her connection to a duke. The way she caught herself smiling at nothing when his letters arrived, and the way she scolded herself afterward for behaving like a lovesick girl. "I do not know what I feel," she confessed in one letter. "When I read your words, my heart tells me that you are the same man I fell in love with through 53 letters addressed to a stranger. But my mind reminds me that you lied, that you created a fiction and allowed me to invest my emotions in it. How do I reconcile these truths? How do I trust my heart when it has already proven itself capable of loving a mirage?" His response came 3 days later. "You cannot trust your heart," he wrote. "Not yet. Hearts are foolish things, easily deceived and often mistaken. What you can do is trust time. Trust the accumulation of days and letters and small revelations that add up to something resembling truth. I am not asking you to love me now. I am asking you to give me the chance to prove that the man you loved in those 53 letters was not a fiction, but simply a version of myself that I was too afraid to claim openly. I am still that man. I have simply stopped hiding behind a dead soldier's name." The letters continued through the winter months. As the snow fell and the roads grew treacherous, the courier still appeared faithfully at Carenza's door. She began to anticipate his arrivals with an eagerness she could not quite suppress, rushing to tear open each envelope before the seal had fully cooled. She learned things about Emmerich that she had never known, his favorite poets and the books that had shaped his childhood, the horse he had raised from a foal and ridden to war, who had somehow survived and now lived in comfortable retirement in the Waldron stables, the way he took his tea, which was exactly the way she took hers, with honey and a splash of cream. She learned that he had a sense of humor buried beneath his responsibilities, dry and self-deprecating and capable of making her laugh out loud in her empty cottage. And she learned that his feelings for her were not diminishing with distance. If anything, they seemed to grow stronger with each passing week. "I have been offered a match," he wrote one evening in late January. The words struck Carenza like a physical blow. "Lady Hortensia Graves, daughter of the Earl of Thornbury. A suitable alliance, according to my advisers. Her family is wealthy, her bloodline impeccable, her temperament reported to be agreeable." Carenza felt her fingers tighten on the paper as she continued reading. "I declined the offer immediately," Emmerich continued. "My advisers think I have gone mad. Perhaps I have. A duke does not reject advantageous marriages in favor of pining after seamstresses in provincial villages. It is not done. It is not practical. It is not sensible. But I find that I do not care about what is done, or practical, or sensible. I care only about a woman who taught me to feel again when I had convinced myself that feeling was beyond my reach. I care only about the chance, however slim, that she might someday care for me in return. The marriage market will have to content itself with other dukes. This one is not available. Carenza read the letter 6 times. Then she sat down and wrote her response with unsteady hands. "You foolish, impossible man," she began. "You should have accepted the match. Lady Portentia Graves is everything I am not. Wealthy, noble, appropriate. The kind of woman who belongs in a duke's household, hosting elegant parties and bearing aristocratic airs. What can I possibly offer you that could compare to that?" She paused, her pen hovering over the page. Then she continued. "And yet, when I read that you declined her, my heart nearly burst from my chest with relief. I should want you to be practical. I should want you to make the sensible choice. Instead, I find myself grateful that you chose the insensible one. What does that say about me? What does that say about us? I do not have answers. I only have questions and a growing certainty that I do not want you to stop writing. Yours in confusion and something that might be hope." Carenza she sealed the letter and gave it to the courier the next morning. And she waited, with bated breath, to see what would happen next. Spring arrived slowly in Brindleshire, winter's grip releasing its hold one grudging inch at a time. The correspondence between Carenza and Emmerich had continued without interruption through the darkest months, their letters growing longer and more intimate as the weeks passed. She had begun to recognize his moods from his handwriting alone, the way his script grew cramped when he was tired, expansive when he was happy, jagged when the nightmares had kept him awake. She had also begun to recognize something else. She was in love with him, not with Hadrian Voss, the dying soldier, not with the idealized figure she had constructed from words on paper, with Emmerich Thorne in all his complicated, damaged, and infuriating reality. The man who had lied to her and then spent months trying to earn her forgiveness. The man who made her laugh and made her think and made her feel things she had convinced herself were beyond her reach. She had not told him yet. The words felt too momentous to commit to paper, too significant to trust to a courier's saddlebag. If she was going to confess her love, she wanted to do it while looking into his eyes. She wanted to see his face when he heard her say it. The letter that arrived in early April changed everything. "Carenza," it began, and she noticed immediately that he had dropped the formal Miss Whitford he had clung to for so long. "I am coming to Brindleshire. I know you asked for time, and I have tried to give it to you. But something has happened that cannot be explained in a letter. Something that requires me to see you in person. Please do not be alarmed. I am not ill, nor is anyone at Voldrin in danger. But there is a decision I must make, and I cannot make it without knowing where you stand. I will arrive within the week. If you do not wish to see me, send word to the inn, and I will respect your wishes. But if there is any chance, any possibility that you might welcome my presence, I beg you to give me an audience. The future, mine and perhaps ours, depends on what happens next. Yours, always and completely." Emmerich Carenza read the letter with her heart lodged firmly in her throat. What decision? What had happened? The vagueness of his words set her nerves jangling with anxiety, even as the prospect of seeing him again sent electricity crackling through her veins. She did not send word to the inn. She spent the next 5 days in a state of barely controlled anticipation, cleaning her cottage until it gleamed, mending her best dress, practicing what she would say when he arrived. The villagers noticed her agitation and whispered among themselves, but Carenza ignored them. Let them speculate. They would know soon enough. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, riding the same horse he had described in his letters, the war veteran who had carried him through hell and somehow emerged intact. Carenza watched from her window as he dismounted, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it. When she opened the door, he was standing on her doorstep just as he had been 6 months ago, but everything about him was different. He held himself with more confidence, his eyes clear and steady, his face no longer marked by the exhaustion and pain that had characterized their first meeting. He looked healthy. He looked hopeful. He looked like a man prepared to fight for what he wanted. "Miss Whitford." His voice was warm but formal, respectful of the boundaries they had established. "Thank you for seeing me. You said there was something you needed to tell me." Carenza stepped aside to let him enter. Something that could not wait for a letter. "Yes." He moved into her parlor, and she noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "May I sit?" She gestured toward the chair by the hearth, the same chair where she had bandaged his wounds half a year ago. He sat, and she took the chair across from him, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. "Tell me," she said. Emmerich took a deep breath. "The king has offered me a position," he said. "An ambassadorship to Kesteval. A chance to help negotiate the peace treaty that will finally end this war." Carenza's eyes widened. That is an extraordinary honor." "It is. And it would require me to leave Aldermain for at least 2 years, possibly longer. The negotiations will be complex, the work demanding. I would be living in a foreign court, surrounded by former enemies, trying to build a peace that has eluded diplomats far more skilled than I. Then you must accept." The words came out steady, despite the way her heart was cracking. "You cannot refuse such an opportunity. The good you could do, the lives you could save by ending this war." "I know." Emmerich's eyes never left her face. "But there is a complication." "What complication?" "You." The word hung in the air between them. "I cannot accept this position without knowing where we stand," Emmerich continued. "If I go to Kesteval, I may not return for years. The distance between us, already significant, would become nearly insurmountable. Letters would take months to arrive, if they arrived at all. Whatever we have been building through our correspondence would face a test that might prove too great to survive." Carenza's throat tightened. "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you will wait for me." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I am asking if what you feel for me is strong enough to endure years of separation and uncertainty. And if it is not, if you cannot make that promise, then I am asking you to tell me now, so that I can make my decision with clear eyes. And if I say no," Carenza forced the question past her lips, "if I tell you that I cannot promise to wait, will you refuse the ambassadorship?" Emmerich was silent for a long moment. "I do not know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to say yes, that I would throw away any opportunity if it meant keeping you. But I have seen what this war has done to our kingdom, to its people, to young men like Hadrian Voss, who marched north and never came home. If there is a chance I can help end that suffering, do I have the right to refuse?" "No." Carenza shook her head. "You do not, and I would never ask you to. Then what is your answer?" She rose from her chair and crossed to where he sat. He looked up at her, vulnerable and hopeful and terrified all at once, and Carenza felt the last of her resistance crumble into dust. "My answer," she said softly, "is that I have spent the last 6 months falling in love with you. Not with Hadrian Voss. Not with the Duke of Waldron. With you, Emmerich Thorn. The man who lied to me, and then moved heaven and earth to make it right. The man who writes letters that make me laugh and cry in equal measure. The man who refused an advantageous marriage because he could not forget a seamstress in a provincial village." Emmerich's breathing faltered. "My answer," Carenza continued, "is that I will wait for you. Not because you have asked me to, but because I cannot imagine a future that does not include you in it. Go to Kesteval, negotiate your peace treaty, save as many lives as you can, and when you are finished, come back to me." He rose from the chair, bringing them face to face, close enough that she could see the moisture glistening in those gray eyes that held gathering storms. "I love you," he said, the words emerging raw and unguarded. "I have loved you since your first letter, and I will love you until my last breath." "Then we are in agreement," Carenza whispered, "because I love you too." He kissed her then, for the first time, his hands cupping her face with a tenderness that made her heart ache. It was not the passionate embrace of novels and fairy tales. It was something quieter, deeper, and more profound. A promise sealed in the press of lips, a vow spoken without words. When they finally separated, both breathing unsteadily, Emmerich rested his forehead against hers. "I will write to you every day," he said, "even if the letters take months to arrive. Even if you do not receive them until I am already on my way home. I will write, and I will count the days until I can return to you." "And I will wait," Carenza replied, "for as long as it takes." The wedding took place 3 weeks before Emmerich's departure for Kesteval. It was not the grand affair that society expected of a duke's nuptials. There were no 100 guests in silk and diamonds, no cathedral festooned with flowers, no week-long celebration of aristocratic excess. Instead, there was a small chapel in Brindleshire, half filled with villagers who had known Carenza all her life, and a handful of Emmerich's closest associates who had made the journey from Waldron. Carenza wore a dress of pale blue silk, commissioned from the finest seamstress in the region, which happened to be herself. She had spent 2 weeks on the garment, pouring all her skill and love into every stitch, and when she looked at herself in the mirror on the morning of her wedding, she saw not a seamstress or a merchant's daughter or a woman who had clawed her way through years of poverty and loss. She saw a bride. She saw a duchess. The title still felt foreign on her tongue. The Duchess of Waldron. The villagers had struggled with it as well, alternating between excessive deference and confused familiarity. Old Mrs. Pemberton from the bakery still called her Carrie Dear when they met in the lane, while Magistrate Corwin bowed so deeply each time he saw her that she feared for his back. But none of that mattered as she walked down the aisle toward the man waiting at the altar. Emmerich watched her approach with an expression that made her heart stutter. He looked almost unbearably handsome in his formal attire, but it was not his appearance that stole her breath. It was the way he looked at her, as if she were the only person in the world, as if the chapel and the guests and the priest had all faded into irrelevance. He looked at her the way he had written about her in his letters, like she was a miracle he did not deserve. The ceremony passed in a blur of sacred words and exchanged vows. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Emmerich kissed her with the same tender intensity he had shown on the day he declared his love, and Carenza felt joyful tears trace down her cheeks. Happy tears, for once. Tears that spoke of a future she had never dared to imagine. The reception was held in the village inn, the largest space available, and the celebration lasted well into the evening. Carenza danced with her new husband, then with his steward, then with 3 separate villagers who had known her since childhood, and still could not quite believe that little Carrie Whitford had married a duke. Through it all, she kept glancing at Emmerich, and each time she found him already watching her, his eyes soft with an emotion that needed no words. They departed that night for Waldron, where they would have 2 weeks together before duty called him away. The journey was long, and Carenza dozed against her husband's shoulder in the carriage, lulled by the rhythm of the wheels and the warmth of his body beside her. She woke as they crested the final hill, and her lungs forgot their purpose. Waldron spread before them in the moonlight, a vast estate of rolling hills and ancient forests, and a manor house that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. It was beautiful and intimidating and utterly foreign, a world away from the cramped cottage where she had spent so many lonely years. "Welcome home," Emmerich murmured against her hair. Home. The word wrapped around her heart like a blessing. The 2 weeks that followed were the happiest of Carenza's life. She explored the estate with Emmerich at her side, learning the names of servants and the history of rooms and the stories behind the portraits that lined the gallery walls. She met his horse, the war veteran, and fed it apples, while Emmerich watched with undisguised adoration. She learned what it meant to be loved completely, without reservation or condition. And then the day of his departure arrived. They stood together in the courtyard as dawn broke over the hills, his traveling cases loaded onto a wagon, his escort waiting at a respectful distance. Carenza had promised herself she would not cry, but the promise shattered the moment she looked into his eyes. "I will come back to you," Emmerich said, cupping her face in his hands. "No matter how long it takes, no matter what obstacles arise, I will come back." "I know." Her voice trembled despite her best efforts. "I have faith in you. Write to me. Every day. Tell me everything. The small things. The ordinary things. The way the light falls through the windows, and whether the cook's bread has too much salt. I want to know every detail of your life, so that when I close my eyes in some foreign palace, I can imagine myself beside you." Carenza managed a watery smile. "I will write until my hand cramps and my ink runs dry. And then I will find more ink and keep writing." He kissed her then, deep and desperate, and full of all the words they had no time to say. When he pulled away, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you, Carenza Thorne. I love you, Emmerich." He mounted his horse, his movements stiff with reluctance. The escort formed up around him, and with a final look over his shoulder, a look that promised everything, he rode away. Carenza stood in the courtyard until long after the dust had settled, her hand pressed against her heart, her eyes fixed on the horizon where he had disappeared. She was a duchess now. She was a wife, and she was alone again. But this time, the loneliness felt different. This time, it was temporary. This time, she had someone worth waiting for. 2 years passed. They were not easy years. The negotiations in Kesteval proved more complex than anyone had anticipated, plagued by political maneuvering and old resentments and the fundamental difficulty of convincing bitter enemies to become cautious allies. Emmerich's letters arrived sporadically, sometimes 3 at once after months of silence, each one a precious lifeline that Carenza read until the paper grew soft with handling. She kept busy at Waldron. The estate required management, and though the stewards were competent, they welcomed her involvement. She learned about crop rotations and tenant disputes and the intricate politics of rural aristocracy. She made friends among the local gentry, cautious alliances that slowly warmed into genuine affection. And she waited. The war ended 18 months after Emmerich's departure, the peace treaty signed in a ceremony that the newspapers described in breathless detail. Carenza read every account she could find, searching for mention of her husband, and felt fierce pride when his name appeared among the principal architects of the agreement. But the treaty's signing did not mean immediate return. There were details to finalize, relationships to cement, a fragile peace to nurture through its vulnerable infancy. Emmerich wrote that he would be home soon, then wrote again apologizing for delays, then again with new complications. Carenza understood. She told herself she understood, but understanding did not stop her heart from aching. The letter that arrived on a rainy afternoon in late autumn was different from the others. Shorter, more urgent. "My darling," it read, "I am coming home. Not soon. Now. By the time this letter reaches you, I will already be on the road. Nothing could keep me away a moment longer. Prepare yourself, my love. Your husband is returning, and he has no intention of ever leaving again. Yours, in desperate anticipation, Emmerich Carenza read the letter 3 times, her entire body trembling. Then she began to prepare. She was standing in the entrance hall when the sound of hoofbeats echoed in the courtyard. She had positioned herself there since dawn, unable to eat or rest or do anything but wait. The servants had given up coaxing her away and simply brought tea at regular intervals, which she did not drink. The great doors swung open, and there he was. He looked older, lines carved around his eyes that had not been there before. His hair was longer, touched with gray at the temples. He moved with the slight stiffness of a man who had spent too many months in uncomfortable chairs, negotiating impossible compromises. But his eyes, when they found her, were exactly the same. Gray as gathering storms and full of love. Carenza. Her name emerged as a breath, a prayer, a benediction. You came back. She did not remember crossing the hall, but suddenly she was in his arms, her face buried against his chest, his heart pounding beneath her cheek. You actually came back. I promised I would. His voice was rough with emotion. I have never broken a promise to you. I never will. They stood there for a long moment, simply holding each other, 2 years of separation dissolving in the warmth of reunion. The servants had tactfully disappeared, granting them privacy for this moment that felt too sacred for witnesses. When Carenza finally pulled back to look at him, she saw tears on his cheeks. The war is over, he said. The treaty is signed. The peace is holding. I have done what I was sent to do. You saved countless lives. Pride swelled in her chest. You helped end a conflict that has torn our kingdom apart for years. Perhaps, his hands framed her face, thumbs brushing away the tears she had not realized she was shedding. But none of it would have been possible without you. Every night in that foreign court, surrounded by people who wanted things from me, I thought of you. I remembered that somewhere across the sea, there was a woman who loved me for who I am, not what I could provide. That knowledge kept me sane when nothing else could. Emmerich. I wrote you 53 letters from Kesteval, he continued, the same number you wrote to a dying soldier before we ever met. It seemed fitting, somehow. A full circle. Carenza laughed through her tears. You counted? I counted everything. The days until I could see you again. The hours until I could hold you. The minutes until I could tell you in person what I have written 100 times on paper. He drew a breath. I love you, Carenza Thorne. I loved you when you were a stranger who wrote to a dead man. I loved you when you were a seamstress who bandaged my wounds and demanded I earn her trust. I love you now, as my wife, my duchess, my partner in everything that matters. I love you too. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. I have loved you through absence and uncertainty and 2 years of waiting that felt like 2 lifetimes. Then let us make sure we never have to wait again. He kissed her, and it felt like coming home. Later that evening, after dinner and reunion and conversations that stretched long into the night, Emmerich presented her with a small box wrapped in velvet. I brought you something from Kesteval, he said, a token of the peace we built. Carenza opened the box to find a pendant on a silver chain, delicate and beautiful, but it was not the craftsmanship that stole the air from her lungs. It was the design. 2 quills crossed over an open letter, framed by a wreath of roses. I had it commissioned by their finest jeweler, Emmerich explained. A symbol of what brought us together, of the words that saved my life and the woman who wrote them. Carenza looked up at him, this man who had lied to her and then spent years making it right. This man who had given up everything comfortable and safe to fight for peace. This man who had crossed oceans and endured years of separation and come back to her just as he had promised. Help me put it on, she whispered. He fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers warm against her skin. The pendant settled against her heart, cool and solid and real. "There is one more thing," Emmerich said, his voice suddenly hesitant. "Something I have been waiting to tell you until I could say it in person." Carenza tilted her head. "What is it?" He took her hands in his expression caught between joy and terror. "I want children," he said. "Heirs for Valdrin, yes. But more than that. I want a family. I want to fill these halls with laughter and chaos and the patter of small feet. I want to give our children the childhood I never had, full of love and warmth and the certainty that they are wanted." Carenza felt her heart expand until she was certain it would burst. "I want that too," she said. "I have wanted it since before I knew wanting it was possible." "Then we shall have it." He pulled her close, resting his chin atop her head. "We shall have everything we ever dreamed of, you and I. Starting now. Starting tonight." And as the fire crackled in the hearth and the wind whispered against the windows of Voldrin, Carenza Thorne, née Whitford, closed her eyes and allowed herself to believe in fairy tales. Not the kind that happened to other people. The kind that happened to her